welcome everybody this afternoon to our fourth lecture of our series Convergences, Art, Theory, and Practice, and you can call it the starting point of our long Lacan Foucault festival that will also proceed next week, but we already start with a lecture by Dr. Anne van Leeuven from the Department of Philosophy and Religion at James Madison University. I will say a couple of words about Anne in a moment. Just as a reminder, we have a very, very dense program, so tomorrow there will be another event at 98 Weeks, also with Anne van Leeuven, with Maya Gonzalez, and with Samo Tomčić, who will speak, by the way, also here in a public lecture at 5 o'clock on Friday in this building on repression. Today's talk, What is Sexuality? Marx, Lacan, and Foucault, has a handout that was hopefully distributed to everyone. Anne got a PhD in philosophy from the New School for Social Research in New York and wrote her dissertation on Luis Irigaray, and I think I can also call you an expert on Luis Irigaray and Simone de Beauvoir. And you have a forthcoming book, a volume with Oxford University Press on the works of Beauvoir and Irigaray. And your current research is on structuralist and post-structuralist theory. I won't say anything to your talk. There's already an abstract. And without further ado, the floor is yours. Thank you.
So to begin, I'd just like to thank Sami and also everyone here at the Humanities Initiative for inviting me to come to speak. You've been very gracious hosts, and it's a really exciting opportunity for me. And also just to have the invitation to speak to this constellation of issues is for me a very sort of welcome and exciting opportunity. So the text that I'll present is really sort of, as will be clear, I guess, an initial attempt to sort of take up this question and really just to formulate it for myself in some ways as a kind of question. So I thank you for that opportunity to begin to think through. So I'll begin by recalling the relationship between consciousness, language, and division that Marx and Engels formulate in the first chapter of Die Deutsche Ideologie. And this is the very long passage that I have handed out for you. So I'll just begin by reading this through. Only now, after having considered four aspects of the primary historical relationships, do we find that man also possesses consciousness. But even so, not inherent, not pure consciousness. From the start, spirit is afflicted with the curse of being burdened with matter, which here makes its appearance in the form of agitated layers of air, sounds, in short, of language. Language is as old as consciousness. Language is practical consciousness that exists also for other men, and for that reason alone, it really exists for me personally as well. Language, like consciousness, only arises from the need, the necessity of intercourse with other men. Where there exists a relationship, it exists for me. The animal does not enter into relations with anything. It does not enter into relation at all. For the animal, its relation to others does not exist as a relation. Consciousness is therefore, from the very beginning, a social product, and remains so as long as men exist at all. Consciousness is at first, of course, merely consciousness concerning the immediate sensuous environment, and consciousness of the limited connection with other persons and things outside the individual who is growing self-conscious. At the same time, it is conscious of nature, which first confronts man as completely alien, all-powerful, and an unassailable force, with which man's relations are purely animal, and by which they are overawed like beasts. It is thus a purely animal consciousness of nature, natural religion, precisely because nature is as yet hardly altered by history. On the other hand, it is man's consciousness of the necessity of associating with individuals around him. The beginning of the consciousness that he is living in a society at all. This beginning is as animal as social life itself at this stage. It is merely the herd consciousness, and at this point, man is distinguished from sheep only by the fact that with him, consciousness takes the place of instinct, or that his instinct is a conscious one. This sheep-like or tribal consciousness receives its further development and extension through increased productivity, the increase of needs, and what is fundamental to both of these, the increase of population. With these, there develops the division of labor, which was originally nothing but the division of labor in the sexual act. Then the division of labor, which develops spontaneously or naturally by virtue of natural predispositions, for example, physical strength, needs, accidents, etc., etc. Division of labor only becomes truly such from the moment when a division of material and mental labor appears. From this moment onwards, consciousness can really flatter itself that it is something other than consciousness of existing practice. That it really represents something without representing something real. From now on, consciousness is in a position to emancipate itself from the world and to proceed to the formation of pure theory, theology, philosophy, morality, etc. Okay, so I'll stop reading from Marx. This long and dense passage draws together a set of issues that can be marked through a series of questions. What is the relationship between consciousness and language? Between language and social relations? Between social relations and division? And finally, what is the relationship between the two articulations of this division? The social division of labor and the division of labor in the sexual act. Of course, we find a response to these questions already in the passage. Consciousness for Marx and Engels does not refer to pure consciousness as ideality or interiority. Rather, consciousness is material consciousness that exists in the form of language. Language exists from the moment in which human beings enter into social relations. What is called consciousness, then, refers to the symbolic structure of these social relations. And in turn, these social relations are constituted by a division. And ideological consciousness is the expression of this division. It is on this basis that consciousness can flatter itself that it is pure consciousness. That it is, as Marx and Engels put it again, something other than consciousness of existing practice. That it really represents something without representing something real. The illusory independence of pure theory from the socio-symbolic relations that are constitutive of consciousness is thus an expression of this division. What we have then is a preliminary answer to this short series of questions. Consciousness refers to socio-symbolic relations. These relations are structured by a division of labor, and this division is constitutive of ideological consciousness. One question, however, remains. What of the sexual division? In what sense is the division of labor originally, again, nothing but the division of labor in the sexual act? What exactly is meant by a division of labor in the sexual act? Does this sexual division, like the social division, refer to a division of sexual activity, sexuality, and the products of sexual labor, reproduction? And if so, rather than some kind of original biological antagonism, an originary sexual division that would be a posteriori represented in other social practices, what is at stake here is rather a socio-symbolic division of sexuality and reproduction. In what follows, I will attempt to elaborate this claim through two lenses, drawing on the work of Lacan and Foucault. With Lacan, on one hand, it is possible to think this division vis-a-vis his analysis of sexuality as a lack which, and I quote, the living being incurs in reproducing himself through the way of sex. This is his formulation in Seminar 11. With Foucault, sexuality appears as the effect of biopower, which is to say power's investment in reproduction vis-a-vis the disciplining of bodies and the management of population. What we find then in Lacan and Foucault are two distinct elaborations of this division of labor in the sexual act, both of which propose materialist critiques of this division while underlining the distance of this claim from any kind of pseudo-materialist reductivism. So I'll begin with Lacan. The discussion of Lacan will focus on his account of sexuality in Seminar 11, the text from which I've already briefly cited. This the text of Four Fundamental Concepts of Psychoanalysis. According to Lacan, and I quote, sexuality is established in the field of the subject by a way that is that of a lack. Two lacks, and I'm still quoting, two lacks overlap here. The first emerges from the central defect around which the dialectical advent of the subject to his own being in relation to the other turns. By the fact that the subject depends on the signifier, and that the signifier is first of all in the field of the other. This lack takes up the other lack, which is the real earlier lack to be situated at the advent of the living being, that is to say, at sexed reproduction. The real lack is what the living being loses, that part of himself qua living being, in reproducing himself through the way of sex. This lack is real because it relates to something real, namely that the living being, by being subject to sex, has fallen under the blow of death. That's the end of the quote. Sexuality, we are told, is constituted in relation to lack. The lack of subjectivation, the lack that is instituted in the subject as an effect of the signifier, takes up another earlier lack, the lack of sexual reproduction. This sequence of lacks, or the formulation of it in these terms, seems to reiterate and recall Marx and Engels' claim that the socio-symbolic division of labor has its ground in the division of labor in the sexual act. I'll try to examine Lacan's discussion then of these two lacks in parallel with this claim in Marx and Engels. The first lack, as we've said, refers to the structure of the signifier as constitutive of the subject. In Seminar 11, Lacan describes the structure of the signifier in terms of the function of a cut that constitutes the subject as divided. This cut institutes a topological division of fields, what Lacan calls the field of the subject and the field of the other, or what he also refers to as the field of being and the field of meaning. As such, the subject, according to Lacan, is, and I quote, condemned to appearing only in this division, end quote. It's condemned to appearing only in the division of these two fields. And I quote again, if it appears on one side as meaning produced by the signifier, it appears on the other as apophanesis, as disappearance. The subject is condemned to appearing only in the field of the other, and the cost of this appearance is its disappearance. Lacan describes the structure of subjectivation in Seminar 11 as alienation. The subject is alienated then, not simply because it appears only in the field of the other, although this is true, but because its appearance in this field implies at the same time its disappearance. As Lacan puts it, and I quote, the subject is born insofar as the signifier emerges in the field of the other. But by this very fact, this subject, which was previously nothing, is not a subject coming into being, if not a subject coming into being, solidifies into a signifier. Alienation for Lacan refers to the constitutive loss, that is the price of the subject's appearance in the field of the other, the field of meaning or the symbolic. What this means, according to Lacan, is that the subject is constituted in the disjunction of these two fields. He illustrates this vis-a-vis his analysis of the logical operator of disjunction, of or, the vel. In formal logic, this operator is, of course, used in an inclusive sense, either one or the other or both. The operation that constitutes a subject through the disjunction of the field of being and meaning has the opposite form. It refers not to either one or the other, but to neither the one nor the other. What this operator indicates is that the choice of the subject, according to Lacan, is forced. If we choose being, the subject disappears. It eludes us, falling into non-meaning. If we choose meaning, the meaning survives, only deprived of that part of non-meaning that is, and I quote, is strictly speaking that which constitutes in the realization of the subject the unconscious. The subject must choose meaning, but this choice at the same time entails a loss that constitutes the unconscious. This choice then is ultimately a kind of ultimatum, as Lacan puts it. It is the same kind of choice Lacan suggests that is presented in the alternative, either your money or your life. One cannot choose the former without giving up both. And so the choice is already determined in advance, but of course implies a loss. This loss, however, as Lacan points out, is a paradoxical one, since it is the constitution of the symbolic that institutes a loss that did not exist prior to its advent. It is a loss that is as a past that was never present. This then is the first lack of which Lacan speaks. The lack of that which, as he puts it, first emerges from the central defect around which the dialectical advent of the subject to his own being in the relation to the other turns. This is the first lack. What then of this second lack? The other lack that is, as he says, in fact, the real earlier lack, which is, again, quote, to be situated at the advent of the living being, that is to say, at sex reproduction. Lacan's claim is that sexuality is established in the field of the subject as lack in relation to sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction for Lacan refers to the field of socio-symbolic reproduction, according to the function of the signifier, while sexuality as lack emerges in relation to this field. What we have, once again, is a topological division, in fact, the same topological division that constitutes sexuality as fundamentally divided or split. Sexuality is constituted in the field of the other, the field of meaning as libido. Yet the price of the appearance in this field is its disappearance, non-being or death. It is in this sense, it is the sense of loss that is the cost of the appearance of sexuality in the field of sexual reproduction. And I quote Lacan, what the living subject loses by having to pass for his reproduction through the sexual cycle. Lacan accounts for the structure of the drive in these terms. As he puts it, in this way, I explain the essential affinity of every drive with the zone of death, and reconcile the two sides of the drive, which at one and the same time makes present sexuality in the unconscious and represents in its essence death. So from this very schematic sketch, we can return to a kind of parallel with Marx and Engels' text. If what is at stake for Marx and Engels is in the division of labor, is the division of labor in the sexual act, which amounts to a division of activity, a division of the activity and the products of sexuality, a division of sexuality and reproduction, we find an analysis of exactly this division in Lacan. Sexuality for Lacan refers to neither the one nor the other, neither to reproduction and its socio-symbolic articulation, nor to the disappearance generated by its appearance in this field. Rather, sexuality refers to this field or this division as constitutively split. Okay, so this is one side of the parallel I wanted to sketch. The other one I want to take up through by turning to Foucault and La Volonté de Savoir. This text, and I'll focus simply on his critique of the repressive hypothesis in this text. So here Foucault argues that this, against the claim that the 17th century inaugurates an age of sexual repression, famously. A hypothesis that he seems to equivocate at various places in the text with a materialist critique, as well as with the position of psychoanalysis. I quote from the opening gamut of the text. He says, by placing the advent of the age of repression in the 17th century after hundreds of years of open spaces and free expression, one adjusts it to coincide with the development of capitalism. It becomes an integral part of the bourgeois order. The minor chronicles of sex and its trials is transposed into the ceremonious history of the modes of production. Its trifling aspect fades from view. A principle of explanation emerges after the fact. If sex is so rigorously repressed, this is because it is incompatible with a general and intensive work imperative. At a time when labor power was being systematically exploited, how could this capacity be allowed to dissipate itself in pleasurable pursuits, except in those reduced to a minimum that enabled it to reproduce itself? This is the end of the quote. According to this hypothesis, as it is presented by Foucault above, by reducing sexuality to reproduction, repression played a crucial role in the accumulation of labor power. That is to say, by restricting sexuality to the bedroom of the procreative couple and prohibiting non-procreative sexualities, repression thereby appeared to play a part of broader mechanisms of enclosure and confinement that allowed for the accumulation of labor power. In turn, by rejecting this hypothesis, Foucault appears to distance his position from an analysis, from an incarnate materialist critique of these relations. In fact, however, what we see is that Foucault's analysis of sexuality revolves around a materialist critique of biopower. Biopower refers to political power, not, as he of course insists, as sovereignty, which is to say as prohibition and punishment, that is a form of the power not to take life. Rather, as biopower, power is a form of an investment into and management of life. With the development of biopower, biological existence is politicized and life itself enters into the field of power's control and intervention. Foucault describes biopower as the threshold of modernity. I quote, "For millennia, man remained what he was for Aristotle, a living animal with the additional capacity for political existence. Modern man is an animal whose politics places his existence as a living being into question." End of quote. In his analysis of sexuality, Foucault tracks the deployment of biopower according to two axes in his text: the discipline of bodies and the calculated management of population. In his analysis of power, Foucault makes two crucial claims. First, he argues that sexuality is the effect of the deployment of biopower along the lines of these two axes of the reproduction of biological life. As he puts it, and I quote, "Sex was a means of access both to the life of the body and to the life of the species." End quote. Second, he claims that the deployment of biopower, and I quote again, was without question an indispensable element in the development of capitalism. End quote. The development of capitalism, and I quote again, would not have been possible without the controlled insertion of bodies into the machinery of production and the adjustment of the phenomena of population to economic processes. End of quote. He is critical of the repressive hypothesis then, not because it aligns the deployment of sexuality with the development of capitalism, but because, according to him, it fails to grasp the way in which sexuality is deployed by biopower as integral to capitalism, which is to say, as part of the disciplining of labor and the management of population. What he argues then, I would suggest, is that at the level of bodies and the species, the target of biopower is reproduction. From the sexualization of children and the hystericization of women on one hand, to the institution of demographics and the imposition of techniques of the management of population on the other hand. These techniques of biopower operate in conjunction. In the case of psychiatry, it is the life of the species. He says themes of health, progeny, race, the future of the species, the vitality of the social body that motivates access to the individual life of bodies. In other words, protecting the health of the species and the collective welfare of society impels the medicalization of the bodies of hysterics and children. On the other hand, disciplining the reproductive body vis-a-vis the imposition of population controls, for example, control over contraception, infanticide, and all of the forms of control of population, say, documented by Federici in her text. These become crucial points of access for the control of population concerned with the management of birth rates, of public health, and with migration. For Foucault, then, the idea of sex as a pre-political biological substratum of the life of bodies and of the species upon which these forces, let me read the sentence again. For Foucault, the idea of sex is a pre-political, biological substratum of the life of bodies and species whose forces and instincts would be prohibited, censored, or erased, and supplanted by a mute and restrained sexuality. This figure is an ideological illusion, which is of course for him, or which is of course I should say for us, and despite Foucault's comments to the contrary, in no way a critique of psychoanalysis. Rather, sexuality for Foucault refers to biopower's investment in reproduction at the level of bodies and the species. As such, Foucault argues that, and I quote, "Sex is the most speculative, most ideal, and most internal element in the deployment of sexuality organized by power in its grip on bodies and their materiality, their forces, energies, sensations, and pleasures." Indeed, conceived as a biological substratum outside of the field of power's effects, sex is precisely the imaginary ideological unity that is determined and constituted through the deployment of sexuality. If his thesis, Foucault's thesis in Discipline and Punish is that the soul is the prison of the body, then we can say that in the history of sexuality, sex is the prison of sexuality. It is the ideological effect of the techniques of biopower that deploy sexuality in the disciplining of bodies and the management of the life of the species. Sexuality refers to the functions, behaviors, material practices that exist in various institutions that Foucault examines, from schools to medical apparatuses to families, with what with Althusser we would call ideological apparatuses. Okay, so so if this is his critique of the insufficiency of the repressive hypothesis, then from the other side, it's exactly the model of sexual revolution that's offered by the repressive hypothesis that Foucault rejects. According to this hypothesis, if sex had been repressed and in its place a mute, puritanical, constrained sexuality has been installed, this repressed sexuality amounts to a kind of distortion of sex that is constituted via the imposition of forms of erasure and silencing. On this model, sexual revolution amounts to a liberation of sexuality that would have the form simply of a proliferation of the discourse of sexuality. As Foucault puts it, and this is from the opening of the text, precisely after he criticizes the alignment of the repressive hypothesis with a sort of quasi-materialist position, he says, there may be another reason that makes it so gratifying for us to define the relationship between sex and power in terms of repression. Something that one might call the speaker's benefit. If sex is repressed, that is condemned to prohibition, non-existence, and silence, then the mere fact that one is speaking about it has the appearance of a deliberate transgression. A person who holds forth in such a language places himself to some extent outside of the reach of power. He upsets the established law, he somehow anticipates the coming freedom. What Foucault rejects then under the auspices of the repressive hypothesis is, on the one hand, a naive pseudo-materialist claim that would locate sex outside of and prior to its interpolation by power, and on the other hand, a liberal idealist form of emancipation that is offered as a correlative of this thesis, that that sex only has to be spoken of to be liberated. Instead, Foucault's claim is that this sex that the repressive hypothesis enjoins us to liberate is already the effect of biopower. It's already the effect of disinterpolation. So here we return once again to Marx and Engels' position that we started with. Sexuality deploys biopower vis-a-vis the function of reproduction and produces the prediscursive ground of sex as its ideological effect. In this sense, if according to Foucault, biopower constitutes the threshold of modernity, and if sex is the means of access to the life of the body and the life of the species, and if biopower's deployment of sexuality was crucial for this development, then we can say that the history of sexuality traced by Foucault in this text is a history of capitalist modernity. So basically, this is what I wanted to set up. I thought I would end in place of a conclusion, a kind of allegory for the kind of constellation that I've tried to sketch. This is an allegory that's provided by Kleist in his infamous tragedy Penthesilea. Probably most of you are familiar with the Greek myth and maybe with also Kleist's retelling of it. The play begins with an army of Amazonian warriors interrupting the Trojan War. Penthesilea, the queen of the Amazons, leads her warriors into battle, and they strike without any evident provocation and without aligning themselves with either the Greeks or the Trojans. What follows is a series of sexually charged near confrontations between Penthesilea and Achilles that culminates in a spectacular battle. As such, the battle of Penthesilea and Achilles appears to invoke a kind of fundamental sexual antagonism as the basis of this primordial and archetypal battle of the sexes. And in this way, we might see a kind of resonance with this starting point in Marx, a kind of tendency to read this as a fundamental ontological division that is being invoked. Yet, if Kleist's tragedy is interesting for us, it's because it sets up an analysis of the division of what we've been talking about as the division of labor and the sexual act along the lines of these two trajectories that I've proposed. What I've been trying to analyze as a division of sexuality and reproduction. Precisely along the lines of this issue of an analysis of biopower and with Lacan of the death tribe. On one hand, in the course of the play, we find out, or it's revealed why it is that the Amazons have inexplicably entered into the Trojan War without aligning themselves with either side. Warfare, for them, is a biopolitical tactic for the management of population, insofar as it is for them the principle of alliance. Each warrior must take as her lover only a warrior that she has defeated in battle. And it is the structure of alliance that governs the management of their population, the reproduction of the species and the continuation of the society of women. Pentesilia's singular obsession with Achilles, however, flies in the face of this biopolitical tactic. And not only does her desire to defeat him in battle in order to claim him as her lover contravene what is supposed to be an arbitrary alliance determined by the vicissitudes and chance of the battle itself, her relentless pursuit of Achilles ultimately costs the Amazonian warriors all of the prisoners that they have captured in battle, and therefore ultimately places this management population into chaos and disarray. And of course, what's interesting is that she's punished, therefore not when she first violates this prohibition. Here we see that the apparatus of power in the management of population is exactly as Foucault describes this mechanism of security. So it's a question of managing at what point, at what moment this constitutes a risk. And so it's not when she contravenes the law that she's punished, but only at the moment where this all of a sudden creates catastrophe for them by jeopardizing the whole structure of what this battle was attempting to constitute. So this is one side. And on the other hand, we are confronted in this tragedy with exactly the same structure of the forced choice that we see in Lacan. Sexuality is a loss that is constituted by its appearance in the field of the other, the field of the libido, or we could say the socio-symbolic order of reproduction. In the course of the battle, of course, this moment of confusion arises where, in fact, Penthesilea has been captured as the prisoner of Achilles, but she thinks that the situation is exactly the opposite, that she has taken him as her prisoner. And he allows her to entertain this illusion for a little while. Eventually, she realizes what is the situation and that it is not he who will go with her as her lover, but she who is to go with him as his. And this for her is, of course, unthinkable. So in response, they part company, and Achilles sends her the following message. This is his messenger speaking. Achilles sends me here, most royal queen, to give his message to you with my voice. Because you crave to lead him home with your prisoner, and on the other hand, he likewise craves to take you back with him, he calls you to the battlefield once more to challenge you again to mortal combat. Let the sword, the iron tongue of fate, decide which one of you best deserves to lick the dirt beneath the other's feet. In lieu of a love letter. Though Achilles in fact plans to submit to her without any contest, of course she attacks him with full force. They meet for a second time in mortal combat, and in this collision it is Penthesilea who in fact kills Achilles, and this is her, of course, Kleist's version of this story. What Kleist shows, however, is that her frenzied attack is simply what Lacan describes as the essential affinity of every drive, every libidinal drive, with the zone of death. As Penthesilea expresses, and perhaps the most infamous lines of this play, a kiss, a bite, they're not so far apart, and the truest lover can easily mistake the one for the other.
Thank you, Anne. We have still some 30 minutes for question and open discussion.
Yeah, clarification if it was
Yes.
just completely confused.
Yes, please.
I was just thinking as you were talking about how and submission to the sexual act is the recognition you get. In all of that passage, where Lacan talks about that, you repeat that frequently, coming back to the sense of submission. You disappear from the field of being, you only appear in the field of being because you submit to act, you disappear from the field. But he never actually, he never used the counter example of what would avoid that scenario. Right? And I was just thinking as you were talking, the counter scenario would be, you stay in being, you don't have meaning, but you don't require sex for reproduction. Would that fit? So you could actually reproduce yourself. It's the fact that you need somebody else. I think that's what he's talking about.
Yeah, I think so.
He doesn't actually say that. He never actually says that explicitly. in the text.
Yeah, but I think you're right. I mean, the claim is that the problem is that sexuality is relation to the other, and it must appear in the field, therefore, of the symbolic. So I take it, yeah, that's the problem. That if we were single cell organisms or something like this, we can reproduce by mitosis, or I'm not sure it's the correct biological term.
Yeah.
You can also ask for clarification.
Yeah. Or
I mean, one point, if I may, put one comment, the convergence actually is a very vulgar summarizing for sure of Foucault and Lacan, very counterintuitively. We were actually on the opposing ends of the debate in the 70s, is precisely the denaturalization of sexuality, and or basically also the dual reading of what sex vis-a-vis sexuality is, and the denaturalization in terms of biopower, of control, and of to be bound to language and to signifiers. So maybe as a structural parallel, maybe you could elaborate a little bit more on this, because normally we would read Foucault as anti-psychoanalysis, and with Lacan we might have a chance, also with the later Foucault, to also against certain, let's say, vulgarizations of the time. I think probably we'll talk about this on Friday again. Also what, let's say, a very simple form of Freudo-Marxism did with the repression hypothesis, reform society by liberating sex, basically, and then in the end ending up with the ultimate submission under the commodity form, the commodification of sexual relations, sexuality as sex. Maybe you could elaborate on that kind of convergence between Foucault and Lacan.
Yeah, and that's why I think it's exactly that convergence that I wanted to situate in different ways, but to see already this in Marx, because this is why I think it's interesting that often this claim here is taken sort of offhand in a way. Okay, what is this? What does Marx mean by the? In a way, I just find it very perplexing actually. What does he mean by this division of labor in the sexual act, right? What actually is a division of labor in the sexual act? That's what I have been thinking about. And so really this paper is really just an attempt to sort of think through this. Of course you can think this through, of course, the history of philosophy has, kind of answer to this. We see this from, I mean, this is my Garay side, but we see this from Plato to, depends where you situate Freud, but Plato to Freud, right? That this is the history of this series of symbolic oppositions that are articulated, and so one can simply transpose then this kind of critique into a reading of this passage in Marx and say that, okay, and this is often, I think, kinds of feminist critiques that are targeted at this passage that we have some kind of ontological reductivism, some kind of biological reductivism, and that insofar as Marx says this is the origin of the division of labor, it's the division of labor in the sexual act, then you have a kind of, this is a basis then also of a critique of, let's say, some kind of, economic reductivism, let's say, in reading this passage too. And I think that in a way the ground is already undercut by the way actually, if we think through what is the meaning of the division of labor in the sexual act, and so I was trying to think through that claim. Basically, that's all I'd like to do today. It's really to try to think a little bit about that claim. What is the division of labor in the sexual act? And I think we see a denaturalization of that's already in Marx, but we can take it up in at least these two ways that I tried to sort of sketch today. Maya?
It seems like the division of labor in the sexual act implies already two things. One of them is labor and domination. Like those are two, or class or something like this. Because the division of labor itself in sexual reproduction is for the sake of the augmentation of the population with respect to, in his words, increased productivity and the increase of needs. So it seems to me that you have a kind of fundamental, or at least there's some way in which either, where is domination in that, in the sexual division of labor there? And then it seems like it's the same thing with Foucault, insofar as biopolitics is a way, or its production of sexuality is also for the augmentation of the population under a given division of labor and under a form of domination. And then, so I'm just trying to figure out, like, or at least just add to what you're saying, that both thinking of the sexual division of labor, like or augmentation of population as like the primary productive force or original one, and then later sexuality becomes itself the force, or maybe the relation, I don't know. But I think my point is that at some point you get the increase in augmentation of the population and sexuality as the force behind this, and the superfluous population. So augmentation of population, and then biopolitics produces too much population, and therefore too much sexuality, or is that the denaturalization of sexuality? But I just wonder, like, how we would think through kind of the relations of domination, biopolitics, and sexuality under sort of late capitalist or more current explosion of population, too much population, and a complete disconnection between augmentation of the population, increase in productivity, increase in needs, and sexuality, forms of, like...
Okay, yeah.
Maybe that's crazy.
No, I think I can follow. I mean, I think definitely in terms of the last part of what you were asking about, biopolitics not simply used as a mechanism to increase, but as also a mechanism for controlling, of course. Like in this functions by also creating I guess you know better than anyone here. This sphere also of abjection, right? So I think that this is compatible with an analysis of biopowers, that it doesn't have to be simply, let's say, a ratcheting up of population, but it's all about management of controls of circulation and flow, and this is both about levels of surveillance and monitoring and keeping track of population, but also determining issues of migration and entry and movements in circulation, and in not just entry as such, but different matrix of migration and flow, and so I think this is compatible. Yeah, it's not something I discuss at all here, but I think it's compatible with with the basic formulation of biopower and for Foucault. But I don't know if I think I'm chopping up
Well,
the
there's
first
a
question.
division between the sexual, there were like 3 divisions. There's the division of labor in the sexual act, the division of biological reproduction and sexuality, or
Yes, so
meaning, being, all these kinds of divisions. I wonder.
So maybe I'll just go back then to the first point about so the question was for me how then to think about what is this division of labor in the sexual act, and I was trying to think about this as the same kind of division that Marx and Engels talk about as this division of the mental and the material, and the division of the activity of labor and its products, which gives rise, of course, to the division. The division of labor is also the institution of private property, and so this is why I suggested that maybe we can think about this division of labor, and maybe this is totally wrong, but this is a sort of hypothesis I was trying to track through in a way, is maybe we can think about then what is the division of labor in the sexual act in exactly that way, that it's a division of, let's say, the activity, it's the splitting of it, the activity which becomes sexuality, and the product which becomes, let's say, reproduction, very broadly conceived, not simply, let's say, biological, simply reproduction, but all of the forms of reproduction. So this is what I was trying to say, is can we think about that division of labor in the sexual act as exactly already this, what he's referring to as exactly this kind of division. And if we did, how could we think through that division in terms of both analysis with Lacan and with Foucault, who both, in a way, I think, give us a kind of way to think about this division, but in ways which, as you point out, denaturalize, of course, both of these terms, but at the same time do so in different ways.
Can we maybe, okay, could we maybe sort of like invert the relationship between Foucault and Marx? Like in the passage that you quoted, the last sentence, right, from this moment onwards, consciousness can really flatter itself, that it is something other than consciousness of existing practice and so on, and from now on consciousness is in a position to emancipate itself from the world and to proceed to the formation of pure theory, theology, philosophy, morality. And if we add sexuality to this list, then we arrive at Foucault. In a sense that, whereas for Marx, I mean, this sort of division of, sexuality is a product of division of labor, a question that you posed, somehow becomes this emancipated consciousness of sexuality that in Foucault enters as a figure of pure discourse.
But that's in a way exactly, thank you for this formulation, because I think that's exactly what I'm trying to get at, is that this is, I think, why Foucault is critical of the repressive hypothesis, because if we treat sexual liberation as simply accomplished in the field of discourse, then we reduce it exactly to, we can simply enumerate this on the list of these ideological purity, right, which are independent of the relations that constitute them. And this is why I think that the real focus for him is with the way in which sexuality is constituted through these interventions of biopower, both in the disciplining of bodies and in the management of the species. That in this way it cannot be, let's say, free-floating from these relations of power that constitute it, but it's exactly the expression of them. And then for Foucault, what we would have to append then to this list of morality theology would be sex. It is the ideological effect of that operation.
Another quick question, because I read a lot recently about this concept of biopolitics and biopower being applied across the board historically. And of course, like you already mentioned, for Foucault it is the threshold, it arrives at the threshold of modernity. And I'm wondering, can it be sort of ahistoricized and applied to, like, let's say, the Assyrian management of populations, or Egyptian, like ancient Egyptian? And what's your take on that?
I mean, in his lectures on security, territory, population, this is where he talks about it. He says, of course, I mean, in the discussion of sexuality is presented as a kind of this threshold of modernity is on historical moment of emergence or something like this. But elsewhere, I think it's sort of less clear that for him this is what we're describing are these various historical sequences. We have sovereignty, then we have discipline, then we have biopolitics, and it seems to me elsewhere he would say, well, okay, we have various operations and configurations of these forms of power in different places, and that this cannot be historicized in this way as you have these three epics, let's say, or something like that. In the way that it seems to be, I think, here. Yeah, I agree.
Can I actually just confirm that in a agree with that in a sense, which is Foucault always makes a huge amount of sense to me until I start thinking about counter examples historically. So I agree with Ange as well that it's you know, it sort of makes sense in terms of broad large-scale periodizations, and then I can think of any number of examples in the late Roman world where it looks pretty much like biopower is in effect. So I agree with that broadening of the project.
Yeah.
What are some of the roles of protesting biopower?
For Foucault?
Or, like, is the trans movement a potential way, or like refusal of gender categories? I mean, these are some of the things that I'm more aware of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that Foucault would think about or be interested in mobilizations around transgender. It's not totally clear to me that he would see this as a form of resistance to biopower, although maybe I'm probably wrong about this, but it seems to me he would think about this in terms of a question of discipline in a way, and in terms of resistance to biopower, I think that, okay, so if we're talking about the way in which power functions and operates at the level of the species, then we would have to think about interventions at this kind of level of analysis. So, I can imagine various forms of disrupting, let's say, the particular mechanisms of through which it is deployed, but if but of course also if it's the case that for Foucault if it's the case that for Foucault the biopower is employed as part of project of capitalism, then we would have to think about the interventions on this level or the transformations on this level. So it cannot be, let's say, simply a kind of individual subversion of, destroying the records of population or refusing to, let's say, identify under these demographics which are offered to us as ways structural critiques, how these forms of the management of population are deployed to exactly these political ends.
There was a biopolitics.
Sovereign.
That's it.
But I think we have another 10-minute extension, or do we?
Yeah, sure.
Sure.
The more I read this passage on the division of labor and the division of labor in the sexual act, the more questions are just popping up, first of all, he claims that the division of labor in the sexual act is original.
Yes,
So
exactly.
it precedes any division of labor, which makes me think of this Lacan's hasty remark that Marx saw a lot of things, but he didn't see that basically it's not about surplus value, it's about surplus jouissance. So basically, this was my first remark to bring in. In both cases, there is the question of surplus that is accompanying this dimension of lack that you were mentioning in Lacan's discussion of sexuality. And in this way, basically, Lacan brings in a very interesting structure that he imports from Freud and from energetics, the idea of entropy, that you basically do not have the right measure between the two, but they always come in couples. So basically, as soon as you have a lack, you also have a demand for surplus, which is basically what keeps the capitalist engine going and makes it potentially infinite. Then I was going to this sentence: division of labor only becomes truly such from the moment when a division of material and mental labor appears, which is then complicating the thing even more insanely, because you get this entire debate of the materiality of labor entering the picture. And okay, this is the early Marx and Engels in Capital. Another division. Then one could also question this: what does this division, this tiling, mean? Does it mean splitting of labor? Does it mean isolation in labor, something that is of a much more paradoxical materiality? Then it would be the division of labor on concrete labor and abstract labor, and the materiality of concrete labor is, this stupid empirical materiality, and the abstract labor is some sort of ontological scandal. It's neither purely performative discursive effect, it's also not something that you can situate, on the level of empirical materiality, which would then push the entire thing towards Foucault, and a question that we could address his critique of sexuality. Of course, sexuality is a fabrication of discourse, but it's at the same time situated in a zone that, if you just say, oh yeah, this was invented by biopower in order to regulate populations, blah blah blah, and produce this sort of reductionism to sex, to biological sexuality, you don't basically address the ontological scandal of sexuality. This is where, this is a bit of a metonymic chain of associations that were triggered basically by this link between division of labor of sexual act and division of labor. But I think, maybe it's not originary and posterior, but the same division.
Exactly.
It's the same division.
That's exactly what I wanted to say.
That is sort of pointing toward an ontological scandal that pertains to the intervention of discourse as such. It just, it's not a question, it's more a blah blah.
No, I agree. And I think that's sort of, in a way, my reaction, because I just find this passage, that's why I want to start with this massive quotation, but I just find it so fascinating. I feel like I could just sort of skim a couple of lines today, but this is what I think where I would like to develop. And I agree exactly with your last comment about the identity, this division is not a question of, you put it here as this is originary, this is founded, but I think, we're talking about the same one, and it relates to exactly what you're calling this ontological scandal that is the place of discourse to, cover,
One short remark on Penthesilea.
Yeah, please.
Of course,
Yeah.
a recognized version of the classic Greek drama. What is, could you say with these last words, that the infamous words, the kiss, a bite, and the confusion of the two in the haste of battle, would then Penthesilea, as on the one hand the exponent of such a early form of biopower, but at the same time be not the jamming, but the confusion, I don't say subversion, that's also another problem of the theory of subversion, but who would she be? As a figure, as an allegory, a figure that would keep or reliquefy the metonymical chain in this denaturalizing movement. Would then she not be something like, I don't know, kind of if there are warriors, then she is the resistance, or some kind of underground, maybe even conspiracy. Maybe not the Marx, but maybe the Lacan of the regime of biopower in the original moment. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think I would like to then connect this with this question of, what is for Foucault, what would be actually a sexual revolution? If it's not some kind of proliferation, then
Anti-sexual.
Yeah. So that's what I would